Good morning. This is going to be a lecture video that will kind of catch you up on the notes that I would have covered in class yesterday. Unfortunately, I had a pre-planned absence, so I missed Gold Team this week. So this is just intended to kind of keep you up to speed with the notes. Remember last week when I saw you, we kind of got up to December of 1916. I told you about the death of Rasputin. So you can see Rasputin in the propaganda here. Remember, not a well-liked figure amongst the Russian nobles, amongst the elites, because they believed he had, too much influence over the Tsar and his family. Of course, they didn't know kind of the real reasons behind the influence at the royal court. So, yeah, this is where we'll pick up here, kind of going through the year 1917 this morning and just telling you really about the different waves of revolution that occurred in Russia during this year. Remember, at this point in time, Tsar Nicholas was still away at the war, but back at home, in the months following Rasputin's death, things really started to spiral out of control. You can see there were bread shortages as bread prices skyrocketed back home. There were strikes back in the capital. Petrograd, in case you're wondering, that's the same as St. Petersburg. They simply renamed the capital because during the war, because they felt that St. Petersburg sounded too German, and Germany was the enemy, of course, during World War One. So you have these revolutionary stirrings, though, that begin happening back at home during the war. At the start of 1917, Nicholas actually ends up sending troops back to the capital and to other big cities like Moscow in hopes that they would restore order to the situation. But instead, many of those soldiers actually ended up joining the revolution. And so it wasn't long after that before the Tsar attempted to go home and kind of, again, bring order on his own. But his train was stopped, and his hand was more or less forced. He was forced to abdicate, to give up power on March 15th, 1917. And yes, after over 300 years as the ruling family, the Romanov dynasty finally came to an end. One thing that I'll point out as well, just with the dates, and I haven't been a big date person throughout the year, so this isn't overly important, but sometimes you might hear historians refer to the revolutions in 1917 in Russia as the February Revolution and the October Revolution. In our notes here, I'm going to call them the March and November revolutions. That's what your textbook will say as well. There's a perfectly good explanation for that. Russia actually had a different calendar than the rest of Western Europe, and it was 2 weeks difference. So, according to us, revolutionary events started in March, at the beginning of March. According to the Russian calendar, it was the end of February. Same thing later in the year. According to our calendar, the revolution, began in early November. According to the Russian calendar, it was late October. So I just, to kind of clarify, if there's confusion, if you're seeing, different months, some of the readings we might have shared with you have maybe, used February and October versus March and November. So like I said, perfectly good explanation for that. But I don't need you to worry too much about the dates here. All right, so what happened after the Tsar was overthrown? Well, just to be clear, the communists did not immediately take over. I think there's sometimes a misconception that Russia immediately moved from the Tsar to communism, and that's actually not the case. There was a provisional government that was created after the Tsar's overthrow. A provisional government is just really supposed to be something temporary until they could kind of figure out what they wanted to do next. So the man pictured there, that's Alexander Kerensky. He was the one in charge of the provisional government. And the biggest mistake that Kerensky made was his policies really were just too close to those of the Tsar. For example, he did not get Russia out of the war. In fact, he doubled down and created even harsher penalties for soldiers that were deserting, for example. They reintroduced the death penalty. So he doesn't win over the soldiers upon taking over. the new government also didn't do enough to address the needs, the demands of the working classes. And so when you think about it, even though the czarist regime had been overthrown, for a lot of people, the new government seemed to too closely go along with the czar's old policies, and this is going to provide opportunity for the communists to take over. So the man pictured there, remember, that is Vladimir Lenin. You've read about him, you've heard about him. He's, of course, the leader of the Bolshevik Party, which was the communist party in Russia. Lenin, remember, had a revolutionary past. His brother had been part of a plot to try to kill the Tsar back in the 1890s. His brother was actually executed for his role in that. So Lenin had long been kind of running in these circles, and that's what had led to his exile. He was on, the authorities were aware of Lenin. He had been on the Tsar's radar for some time. And in 1917, he had been out of the country for the better part of 20 years, had been in exile. In fact, when the revolution breaks out in 1917, he is actually in Switzerland. But he has friends, I guess you could say, that are willing to help him get back to Russia. This is actually a pretty interesting story. If you think about Lenin, he's not present when the revolution begins. In fact, he's all the way across the continent, which, remember, is a continent at war in 1917. So how does a guy get from Switzerland to Russia in the midst of World War I? Well, believe it or not, Germany actually reached out to Lenin, and they wanted to help him get home. Germany actually gets Lenin on a sealed train. That's what you're seeing a depiction of here in the image. Lenin and his comrades were able to board this sealed train, and by April of 1917, they did make it back to Russia. Now, why did Germany do that? Believe it or not, it's a war tactic. Remember, Russia had been Germany's enemy throughout the war. Germany had to divert many of their troops and resources to fight the Russians in the east. And for Germany, they're thinking, hey, if we can get Lenin back home, if he creates issues there, creates unrest, that revolution might, knock Russia out of the war once and for all. And actually, that plan ends up playing out quite nicely for Germany. It doesn't end up shifting the war in their favor, but in the end, at least. But it did help to knock Russia out by the start of 1918. So, real quick, as far as Lenin and the Bolsheviks, what was their party platform? What were their promises that they were making to the people? Well, the slogans on this slide pretty much sum it up. Probably the most famous of their slogans was simple: 3 words: peace, land, and bread. All right, these were the promises they were making to the Russian people. Of course, those were, these are slogans. When you look at peace, land, bread, worker control of production, all power to the Soviets, these are slogans that are going to appeal to the lower classes, whether you're talking about industrial workers or peasants in the countryside. These are groups that are going to typically, welcome some of these new changes. So the poster that you're seeing on this slide, the Russian text there translates loosely to "Lenin sweeps away the world's filth." And you can see Lenin there with his broomstick. He's sweeping away monarchs, right? The king, obviously in this case, the Tsar Nicholas had been overthrown. Down here, you've got kind of monopoly-looking guy with the money bags. They wanted to sweep away the industrialists, the capitalists that were making money off of the working class. And then remember, communists were also anti-religion. So this is an Orthodox priest. And obviously they were also hoping to reduce the influence of the Orthodox Church. Now, what your textbook kind of glosses over, it fails to mention that Lenin and the Bolsheviks tried and failed to seize power earlier in 1917. I told you that Lenin arrived back in April. By summer 1917, they tried to overthrow the government and failed. Lenin actually had to go on the run again. This time he fled to Finland, was there for several months. During that time, kind of reorganized his forces, and they re-entered Russia. in the fall of 1917. And again, depending on which calendar you're honoring, the October or November Revolution, that's the one that succeeds in overthrowing the government. So as you can see here, the Bolsheviks seized the Winter Palace. They gained control of the key transportation hubs, communication hubs in Russia, and despite a relatively small party membership, they had managed to seize control of the government by the end of 1917. So 50,000, for example, sounds like a fairly big number, but in an empire the size of Russia's, it was actually a minority group, a very small political party at the start of 1917, although it did grow considerably during the course of the year. You can see almost 250,000 members of the Bolshevik Party by the end of 1917. So this will be the last slide. This will be where I leave off here. And really, I just wanted to quickly address them. Once the Bolsheviks took over, one of the first things they did was they came through on their promises of peace. So Lenin did agree to a peace treaty with the Central Powers that got Russia out of World War I. It was a harsh treaty for Russia. If you look at the map here, you can see the area in blue, the areas that were ceded to Germany, the areas in red were given to Austria-Hungary, and the territory in green there in the south was given to the Ottoman Empire. So Russia surrendered a great deal of land, but Lenin prioritized peace. He wanted to get Russia out of the war. He thought that the war had been a huge mistake for Russia. And as a true Marxist, as a true communist, he also believed that giving up these lands would be irrelevant moving forward. Because remember, true Marxists, didn't think that their revolution was a national one. They thought that it was going to become a larger, global revolution of workers, right? The workers of the world uniting to kind of change things. So part of the reason why Russia was so willing to give up all of these lands kind of relates back to his revolutionary thinking there. So this is where I'll leave off for today. There will be obviously some assignments posted to Schoology during the remote days, and then when we get back together next week, we will talk about what happens in the aftermath of the communist takeover, and that is, yes, a civil war. But again, we'll get to that topic next week. So I'll talk to you then.